Welcome to the Real News Network, coming to you from our studio in Washington, D.C. On Sunday morning on the George Stephanopoulos Show on ABC, Liz Cheney accused former Chief of Staff for Colin Powell, Larry Wilkerson, of creating a cottage industry, making up fantasy stories about her father, Dick Cheney. Here's what she had to say.
The report, though, that the Vice President's office did ask specifically to have information about Iraq al-Qaeda connections presented to this detainee. Do you deny that?
I think it's very important for us to look at exactly what the facts are. And the facts are that 3 people were waterboarded. The people that are, claims to be waterboarded in these articles are not any of those people. And I think, frankly, you've also got to look at the source of some of these allegations. And one of the big sources is, Colonel Wilkerson. Now, Colonel Wilkerson gets coverage because of his associations with General Powell.
Former Chief of Staff.
Has made a cottage industry out of, fantasies about the Vice President.
Well, he's not the only one reporting it, but it's good to get your answer.
Now, to help us understand what is the truth of all of this, we're joined by Ray McGovern. He's a retired CIA analyst, used to do the morning briefings during the Reagan administration. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome, Paul.
So you've been working with Larry Wilkerson. You've interviewed him for an article you recently wrote. Mm-hmm. What do you make of this fantasy cottage industry of fantasy?
It would be wonderful if it were fantasy. It's all too real. I remember when Larry testified before the Democratic Policy Committee, the only committee that seemed interested 3 years ago. He was with other Iraqi and other analysts, Paul Pillar from CIA, Cole Ford, who headed up State's Intelligence Bureau. And after they got finished talking about what the bureaucracy was saying and how the policy became so skewed, now this was policy on WMD as well as ties between Iraq and al-Qaeda, one of the senators said, well, how did this happen? And everybody kind of demurred, and Larry said, well, I'll give it to you in 3 words. I said, please, the Vice President.
Now, I don't understand. What in terms of the chain of command of the CIA and of the military, where does the Vice President fit? I thought he isn't in that chain of command. How does he order anything of anybody?
Well, Dick Cheney was the acting president. Dick Cheney told George Tenet what to do, and George Tenet said, yes, sir. How high would you like me to jump? You want weapons of mass destruction? No problem. I'll serve them up to you. It's a slam dunk. You want ties between Iraq and al-Qaeda? I can do that too. We have a very friendly Egyptian intelligence service, which is now working on this fellow al-Libi, who ran a training camp for al-Qaeda. And we think he knows about Saddam Hussein training al-Qaeda in chemical and biological weapons. And we've told the Egyptians that. We couldn't really get it very much out of them, but I'll bet the Egyptians can. And thereon hangs a tale.
So just before we get into the al-Libi case, what we have is a fundamental breakdown of the U.S. Constitution, the division of powers, the role of the Vice President, and nobody says anything about it. I mean, I've always thought it takes 2 to megalomania.
Well, if the other side is a sycophant, the other side is somebody that's sort of bubbled up to the top of the bureaucracy, like Colin Powell, and then it's a piece of cake for Cheney. It's really it's kind of a no-brainer. He was allowed to have his head, and he did. And the only other thing that's necessary as far as the CIA is concerned is to have a person, really a charlatan. George Tenet decided that his job was to glad hand and backslap George Bush and Dick Cheney. And if they wanted him to distort the intelligence, well, we know that story. But this story is really interesting because now I have Larry Wilkerson telling me exactly what happened as they were preparing the briefing for Colin Powell to give to the world on the 5th of February.
So do we have, in constitutional terms, a kind of for a while vice presidential coup?
Paul, for the last 8 years, the Constitution has been sort of in abeyance with the willing acknowledgement and acquiescence of the legislative branch, which we used to call the Congress of the United States.
Certainly the leadership of both parties knew exactly what was going on.
It's a vacuum. Yeah.
So what did Wilkerson tell you about the al-Libi case?
Well, I asked him, how exactly did it turn out there that Colin Powell ended up doing, making these ridiculous claims about what I'll never forget the term, a sinister nexus sinister nexus between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. I said, where do you get that stuff? He said, well, Colin Powell and I got together alone in a room up there at CIA headquarters, and after we'd gone through all this stuff about these reports of relations or operational contacts between Al-Qaeda and Iraq, we decided, in the Bronx we call it a crock, okay? We thought it was a crock. We weren't going to use any of it, see? And we went back into the room, and within 10 minutes, George Tenet and John McLaughlin, his reliable deputy, came in, slapped down on the table. We've just got a report from a high-level Al-Qaeda type that Saddam Hussein was indeed instructing them in the employment of biological and chemical warfare agents. Here it is. Wow, it was done with the demonstrable fanfare, as George Tenet was able to do. And so they looked at it, and make a long story short, Colin Powell changed his mind and included it. I said, Larry, was there no specialist from the State Department there to give some reading on this? He said, well, no. He said the head of state intelligence, Carl Ford, a reputable guy, I asked him to come with me to CIA headquarters. He said, no, it's not necessary. Colin Powell knows the story. He knows how I feel about this, and I have direct access to Colin.
Well, we know Colin Powell had already ignored Greg Thielman, who previously ran security and intelligence for state, and had told them that there was no weapons of mass destruction. So there was already a pattern of ignoring the expertise within their own department.
Sure, and Carl Ford kind of knew that. He's a pretty gutsy guy, though. I think he probably really thought that Colin Powell would check with him before he went with a final draft on this stuff. And in reality, he did not. It's really a sad story because there's nothing worse than manufacturing things. And as Larry explains it, they weren't allowed to know who the source was. Now, the source had already been declared by the Defense Intelligence Agency to be a fabricator, okay? And then he retracted, okay? And so here's Larry Wilkerson alone, left dangling in the wind when his boss, Colin Powell, decides to go along with what George Tenet and John McLaughlin say. Now, Larry thought he and Colin Powell had worked this thing out, It's a crock, okay? So what happened behind closed doors? Larry points out that every now and then Colin Powell went behind closed doors with George Tenet. God knows what happened there. But this is really pretty despicable because Al-Libi, he was the fellow. He was the fellow who was given to the Egyptians to do their job on him and admit, and confess. And then later he recanted. Now the most recent thing, and this is really important, all of a sudden he commits suicide at a time when lawyers for the Guantanamo people and others are making it very clear to the Libyans who have him in prison that they want to interview him. They want to pursue this thing. They want to find out about what Al-Libi said first and why he recanted all this business. And guess what? He commits suicide. Now, the problem with that, he's a devout Muslim, okay? Muslims don't commit suicide, usually, okay? Except in Iraq prisons, then sometimes they do. And you know what happens? When their relatives get the body back, gosh, they've shot themselves in the back or in the back of the head.
Well, and often they've beaten themselves black and blue.
Yeah, they're really self-flagellated, these folks.
Now, in Wilkerson's account to you of this, I guess this has come out to some extent publicly, but there's a point where the CIA says to Cheney's office, we don't think there should be more torture, and he says, no, you got to keep going at it. Yeah. Well, what's that?
Well, the CIA interrogators pronounced him compliant, which means you're going to get any more stuff out of him. He's complying. And Dick Cheney's office said, no, give him some more of the business. We need some more information about this tie between Al-Qaeda and Iraq. Now, this is not made up. There were other people in Guantanamo, some Army brass, that have said the same thing now. The main objective of this torture stuff was to make sure we had enough, quote, evidence to show that Iraq was
go back to the first point. Is this legal in and of itself that Cheney is giving direct orders to the CIA?
Paul, you've missed the last 8 years.
No, I understand that, but I'm saying, in terms of what is being discussed. It's most of the conversations taking place about did the torture work or didn't it work. But this point of the violation of the Constitution for a vice president to be issuing direct orders to the CIA and the CIA follows those orders, in some ways seems like an even more important breakdown.
Well, the only time you had Tenet stand up was when his people, the interrogators or the contractors, said, hey, we're not going to torture anybody without a finding. So you go to the president, you have him sign this, no problem, we'll do it. Okay, they got that. Okay, we know that whole story with the lawyers and all that kind of stuff. From there on, it's carte blanche. Now, President is deputizing Dick Cheney to give the orders.
And
to the CIA.
is there an actual deputizing of Dick Cheney?
In fact, that's what happened. In fact, now people don't realize that there are really two CIAs. Okay, there's the one I worked in, the substantive part of the business, and then there's this
In the analysis section.
Yeah, and there's the operational thing. Now, the operational thing is of two kinds. One is to collect information. That's a legitimate part of the CIA. The other is covert action, inherited from the OSS during World War II, okay? Shouldn't be in the same agency, but it is. Now, how is that justified? The National Security Act of 1947 says, the Director of Central Intelligence shall perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence as the head of the National Security Council shall direct. Who's the head of the National Security Council? The President. Is there any vote? No, the President decides. That gives the President, I use this word advisedly, the power to have his own personal Gestapo. The only check on that is a kind of director who will stand up to that and say, no, I won't do this kind of thing, or a Congress that's supposed to have an oversight role, but over the last years has had this overlook role, and we know the result of that now. So it's a structural flaw in the setup of the intelligence apparatus in our country, but it's also there's also a premium on character. I worked for 9 separate directors of Central Intelligence. Most of them stood up to this kind of schizophrenic, two-hatted approach. Most of them had integrity. The last couple have not had integrity.
So just quickly, in terms of going forward, what do you make of go forward, don't look backward, versus a truth commission with everything on the table? Cheney says he wants these 2 CIA memos that will show that there's some of the torture was
Senator
effective.
Senator Feingold has already seen those memos and said they don't say what Cheney says they say. But I agree, everything should be out on the table. We should have an educative, an instructive commission or inquiry where the American people are apprised of the facts to the point where a special prosecutor, if indicated, should do his or her job.
And what about this idea of a truth commission where everything's on the table, from Iraq to Afghanistan to illegal torture?
Well, I think I'm not an expert. This is beyond my pay grade. But I would say that you start with the torture because it's very, very clear what happened and why, who is responsible. And then you broaden it out as it seems to be indicated. But what we need to do is hold people accountable. Otherwise, and there are reports that some of the torture is continuing in places like Bagram, in places like Guantanamo with these goon squads. It's continuing. That's unconscionable because this president has to, I think, Paul, in all reality, I think the president is afraid of the CIA. I think Leon Panetta is afraid of the CIA. And if that's
Leon Panetta, the new director of the CIA.
Yeah, for whom I had great hopes. They have been either co-opted or they're afraid, and that's new. I've never seen that in my 46 years in this city, where the chief executive and the head of the CIA is afraid. And even Nancy Pelosi, did you see how she backtracked to say, no, they're respectable, they're honest, they're hardworking people. I mean the Bush guys. I don't mean the people who work in the CIA. So, if that's the case, if it's come to that point, that's really, really dangerous for our civil liberties. It's dangerous for our foreign policy. It's dangerous for our ability to defend ourselves.
Thanks very much for joining us, Ray.
You're welcome, Paul.
Thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff, Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington is a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the real news.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.